Section 28 of the final report from the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Kasper. Final report from the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. Chapter 9. Investing in Safety, Investing in Response, Investing in the Gulf. Part 3. Recommendation C-4. Congress should provide mandatory funding for oil spill response research and development, and provide incentives for private sector research and development. Specifically, Congress should provide mandatory funding, that is, funding not subject to the annual appropriations process, at a level equal to or greater than the amount authorized by the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, to increase federal funding for oil spill response research by agencies such as Interior, the Coast Guard, EPA, and NOAA, including NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration. To be sure, such mandatory appropriations are rarely done, but they are not unprecedented. Congress has included such a provision when, as here, Congress seeks to target appropriations to support a discrete category of activities where Congress perceives that the need is high and the concern is great that the desired activity will otherwise go unfunded over a sustained period of time. For instance, Congress has provided for an annual mandatory appropriation of $100 million for emergency highway repairs for those damaged by natural disasters or catastrophic failures. Congress also provided for mandatory funding for 5 years for several farm conservation programs in the Farm Security and Rural Investment Act of 2002. By similarly removing oil spill research and development funding from the ordinary appropriations process, Congress can avoid the experience that followed the Exxon Valdez spill, when support for response research and development decreased over time. Moreover, Congress can comply with its pay-as-you-go rules by supporting increased research and development funding with a fee on offshore leases. See Recommendation G2. An advisory board made up of experts from relevant offices of the Department of the Interior, U.S. Geological Survey, Department of Energy, EPA, and NOAA, as well as from professional societies, academia, industry, and non-governmental organizations, should be established to develop a research agency and roadmap. In addition, to promote increased research investments by industry, the Coast Guard should revise its effective daily recovery capacity regulations to encourage the development and use of more efficient oil recovery equipment. At the same time, EPA should revise its oiled water discharge regulations and streamline its permitting process for open water testing. Finally, Congress and the administration should encourage private investment in response technology more broadly, including through public-private partnerships and a tax credit for research and development in this area. 5. The need for new regulations to govern the use of dispersants. The decision to use dispersants involves difficult trade-offs. If dispersants are effective, less oil will reach shorelines and fragile marsh environments, but more dispersed oil will be spread throughout the water column. Prior to the Deepwater Horizon incident, the federal government had not adequately planned for the use of dispersants to address such a large and sustained oil spill, and did not have sufficient research on the long-term effects of dispersants and dispersed oil to guide its decision-making. Officials had to make decisions about dispersant use without important relevant information or the time to gather such information. Under the circumstances, however, the Commission believes that the National Incident Commander, Federal On-Scene Coordinators, and EPA Administrator made reasonable decisions regarding the use of dispersants at the surface and in the subsea environment. Recommendation C5. EPA should update and periodically review its dispersant testing protocols for product listing or pre-approval, and modify the pre-approval process to include temporal duration, spatial reach, and volume of the spill. EPA should update its dispersant testing protocols and require more comprehensive testing prior to listing or pre-approving dispersant products. The Coast Guard and EPA, as co-chairs of the regional response teams and leaders of the Area Contingency Plan drafting process, should modify pre-approvals of dispersant use under the National Contingency Plan to establish procedures for further consultation based on temporal duration, spatial reach, or volume of the spill and volume of dispersants that responders are seeking to apply. EPA and NOAA should conduct and encourage further research on dispersants, including research on the impacts of high-volume and subsea use of dispersants, the long-term fate and effects of dispersants and dispersed oil, and the development of less toxic dispersants. 6. The need to reevaluate the use of offshore barrier berms in spill response. Offshore barrier berms generally do not constitute a viable spill response measure for several reasons. These reasons include the time and cost of construction and the highly variable and dynamic marine environments that limit effectiveness and pose the potential for negative environmental impacts resulting from dredging and filling. Thus, for instance, barrier berms constructed off the shores of Louisiana in response to the Deepwater Horizon spill could not be considered a success. Only a fraction of the project, approximately 6%, was completed by the time the well was capped, and no estimate of the amount of oil trapped by the berms is much more than 1,000 total barrels. In fact, the Louisiana berms project stands out as the most expensive and perhaps most controversial response measure deployed to fight the Deepwater Horizon spill. The decision to approve the project as one of the oil spill response techniques to be funded by the responsible party was based primarily on the demands of local and regional interests rather than on a scientific assessment of its likely efficacy. Recommendation C6. The Coast Guard should issue guidance to establish that offshore barrier berms and similar dredged barriers generally will not be authorized as an oil spill response measure in the National Contingency Plan or any area contingency plan. D. Advancing well containment capabilities. As described in Chapter 5, the most obvious, immediately consequential, and plainly frustrating shortcoming of the oil spill response set in motion by the events of April 20th, 2010, was the simple inability of BP, of the federal government, or of any other potential intervener to contain the flow of oil from the damaged Macondo well. Clearly, improving the technologies and methods available to cap or control a failed well in the extreme conditions thousands of feet below the sea is critical to restoring the public's confidence that deepwater oil and gas production can continue and even expand into new areas in a manner that does not pose unacceptable risks of another disaster. Better technology and methods are also needed to gather accurate information in the event of an accident or failure. This section discusses the Commission's recommendations for advancing well containment capabilities in the wake of the Macondo well blowout. 1. The need for government to develop greater source control expertise. As described in Chapter 5, at the time of the Macondo well blowout on April 20th, the U.S. government was unprepared to oversee a deepwater source control effort. Though the public expected federal authorities to take charge once the accident occurred, neither MMS nor the Coast Guard had the expertise or resources to supervise BP's well containment efforts. Once the Secretary of Energy's science team, the U.S. Geological Survey, the national laboratories, and other sources of scientific expertise became involved, the government was able to substantively supervise BP's decision-making, forcing the company to fully consider contingencies and justify its chosen path. The government's oversight effort was assisted by outside industry experts, although their involvement also raised some concerns about conflicts of interest, sharing of proprietary information, and potential liability for the participants that were never resolved. Recommendation D1. The National Response Team should develop and maintain expertise within the federal government to oversee source control efforts. The National Response Team should create an interagency group, including representation from the Department of the Interior, Coast Guard, and the Department of Energy and its national laboratories, to develop and maintain expertise in source control, potentially through public-private partnerships. The proposed Ocean Energy Safety Institute at the Department of the Interior could play a role in developing such expertise. In addition, the EPA should amend the National Contingency Plan to define and institutionalize the role of federal agencies and the national laboratories that possess relevant scientific expertise in source control, and create a mechanism for involving outside industry experts in source control design and oversight. 2. The need to strengthen industry's spill preparedness. Beyond attempting to close the blowout preventer stack, no proven options for rapid source control in deep water existed when the blowout occurred. BP's initial exploration plan for the area that included the Macondo prospect identified only one response option by name, a relief well, which would take months to drill. Although BP was able to develop new source control technologies in a compressed time frame, the containment effort would have benefited from prior preparation and contingency planning. Recommendation D2. The Department of the Interior should require offshore operators to provide detailed plans for source control as part of their oil spill response plans and applications for permits to drill. Consistent with the enhanced planning process described above in Recommendation C1, oil spill response plans should be required to include detailed plans for source control. These plans should demonstrate that an operator's containment technology is immediately deployable and effective. BOE MRE has recently issued a notice to lessees requiring operators to demonstrate as part of the spill response planning process that they have access to and can deploy surface and subsea containment resources that would be adequate to promptly respond to a blowout or other loss of well control. In enforcing this notice, BOE MRE must ensure that operators provide detailed descriptions of their technology and demonstrate that it is deployable and effective. In applications for permits to drill, the Department of the Interior should require operators to provide a specific source control analysis for each well. The analysis must demonstrate that an operator's containment technology is compatible with the well. The Department of the Interior could implement this requirement through amendments to existing regulations or through a notice to lessees. The latter option could be implemented more quickly, though the former might be more permanent. As with oil spill response plans, source control plans should be reviewed and approved by agencies with relevant experience, including the Department of the Interior and the Coast Guard. 3. The need for improved capability to develop accurate flow rate estimates. As described in Chapter 5, early flow rate estimates were highly variable and difficult to determine accurately. However, the understated estimates of the amount of oil spilling from the Macondo well appear to have impeded planning for and analysis of source control efforts like the Coffer Dam and especially the Top Kill. U.S. Geological Survey Director Marcia McNutt stated that if a similar blowout occurs in the future, the government will be able to quickly and reliably estimate oil flow using the oceanographic techniques that eventually provided an accurate estimate of the flow rate from the Macondo well. Recommendation D3. The National Response Team should develop and maintain expertise within the federal government to obtain accurate estimates of flow rate or spill volume early in a source control effort. The National Response Team should create an interagency group, including representation from the Department of the Interior, the Coast Guard, the National Laboratories, and NOAA, to develop and maintain expertise in estimating flow rates and spill volumes, potentially through consultation with outside scientists. In addition, EPA should amend the National Contingency Plan to create a protocol for the government to obtain accurate estimates of flow rate or spill volume from the outset of a spill. This protocol should require the responsible party to provide the government with all data necessary to estimate flow rate or spill volume. 4. The need for a more robust well design and approval process. Among the problems that complicated the Macondo well containment effort was a lack of reliable diagnostic tools. The Deepwater Horizon blowout preventer had one pressure gauge, accurate to plus or minus 400 pounds per square inch. This meant BP and the government could not get accurate pressure readings, which in turn hampered their ability to estimate the oil flow rate, undertake reservoir modeling, and plan for source control operations. In addition, the blowout preventer lacked a means of indicating whether and to what extent its rams and annular preventers had closed. Without such instruments, the government and BP expended significant resources on basic data collection, such as obtaining gamma-ray images of the blowout preventer and adding pressure sensors to the top hat after it was deployed. Meanwhile, the presence of rupture discs in the Macondo well's 16-inch casing led to concerns about well integrity that further complicated the source control effort. BP had not considered the impact of these discs on post-blowout containment when it designed the well. Recommendation D4. The Department of the Interior should require offshore operators seeking its approval of proposed well design to demonstrate that well components, including blowout preventer stacks, are equipped with sensors or other tools to obtain accurate diagnostic information, for example, regarding pressures and the position of blowout preventer rams, and wells are designed to mitigate risks to well integrity during post-blowout containment efforts. E. Overcoming the impacts of the Deepwater Horizon spill and restoring the Gulf. As described in Chapters 6 and 7, even before the Macondo well was finally capped and the oil stopped flowing, major efforts were underway to mitigate and begin to repair the environmental and economic harm caused by the spill. Those efforts are continuing and likely will for years. Nevertheless, any effort to draw lessons learned from the Deepwater Horizon spill for the purpose of developing options, as the Commission's charter states, to guard against and mitigate the impact of any oil spills associated with offshore drilling in the future would necessarily be incomplete without an early appraisal of progress toward longer-term restoration in the Gulf. This section describes the actions and initiatives that have been launched to assess and overcome the impacts of the spill, and presents the Commission's recommendations for steps that should be taken to ensure the following three goals are met. The environment and economy of the Gulf region recovers as completely and quickly as possible, not only from the direct impacts of the spill, but from the decades of degradation that preceded it. The people of the Gulf are fairly compensated for the direct and indirect impacts of the spill, and lessons learned from restoration efforts in the Gulf, including advances in scientific understanding, data collection, mitigation technologies and techniques, planning, and institutional coordination, result in enhanced capacity to remedy the impacts of future offshore oil spills and better manage the myriad economic, environmental, and social interests that must be balanced in the Gulf and other critical offshore areas. 1. The need for improved understanding of oil spill impacts, particularly in the deep water environment. A sophisticated understanding of the full range of impacts from a large-scale oil spill is critical to effective recovery and restoration efforts. Because, however, the concentration and toxicity of oil dissipate rapidly within the first few days to weeks of exposure to the elements, the window of opportunity to collect data in the aftermath of an accident is narrow. For this reason, advanced planning and rapid response mechanisms are essential to capitalize on research opportunities. Independent scientists, many of whom are longtime scholars of the Gulf ecosystem or have unique capabilities, were eager to study the spill and contribute to the injury assessment. However, the independent science community's ability to participate early on was hampered by a lack of timely access to the response zone. This had the effect of diminishing what was learned from the spill. Recommendation E1. The Coast Guard, through the Federal On-Scene Coordinator, should provide scientists with timely access to the response zone so that they can conduct independent scientific research during an oil spill response and long-term monitoring in the future. The National Science Foundation, in consultation with the new National Ocean Council, should expand on its rapid grant program to create a framework under which independent science during a spill can be coordinated with an emphasis on data sharing, communication, and timely access within the response zone. By ensuring that independent scientists can receive expedited funding after an oil spill, government will gain a more complete understanding of spill-related environmental impacts. A demonstrated commitment to independent science will also serve to bolster public confidence and trust. The rush to study the impacts of the Deepwater Horizon spill put a strain on existing scientific resources in the Gulf. Independent industry and government scientists all wrangled for funding, equipment, and vessels, often duplicating efforts in the process. A program that effectively coordinates research initiatives and resources will provide a significant added value to the scientific community under exigent conditions. 2. The need for fair, transparent, compensatory restoration based on natural resource damage assessments. As described in Chapter 6, the Deepwater Horizon spill caused substantial damage to natural resources and habitats across the Gulf Coast and in the deepwater offshore environment. Damages to natural resources are formally assessed subject to regulations established under the Natural Resource Damage Assessment provisions of the Oil Pollution Act. The Act requires that the public be compensated for injury to and lost use of public resources. The regulation provides that compensation should be in place and in kind wherever possible, thereby favoring restoration measures with a connection to the oil spill impacts. The Deepwater Horizon spill is unprecedented in that 5 Gulf states were affected, each with its own restoration agenda, even though most of the damage occurred in Louisiana. The damage offshore is unprecedented and unknown. The trustees responsible for the damage assessment are under pressure to approve projects with an equitable, that is, each state receives an equal portion, allocation of resources that may not be entirely consonant with the in-place, in-kind requirement. Footnote: The Natural Resource Damage Assessment Regulation provides for the designation of affected state, federal, and tribal trustees to conduct the damage assessment of natural resources, achieve agreement on restoration goals, and design and implement restoration projects to meet those goals. In this case, the trustees comprise designated federal and state officials who are encouraged to work together and achieve consensus on restoration goals and projects through a trustee council. While the regulation supports cooperation, it does not explicitly require consensus by the trustees. If certain trustees disagree with the direction of the natural resource damage assessment process, they are free to break away from the council and seek reimbursement for natural resource damages on their own. End footnote. Another challenge for the trustees is assessing and providing compensatory restoration for the potentially significant marine and deepwater impacts associated with this spill. Historically, most applications of the natural resource damage assessment process have focused on coastal restoration, but the Macondo well, which spilled oil 5,000 feet below the surface, may have damaged organisms in the water column or on the seafloor, for which there should be compensation as well. Recommendation E2. The trustees for natural resources should ensure that compensatory restoration under the natural resource damage assessment process is transparent and appropriate. Restoration decisions must be transparent, appropriate, and apolitical. The trustees should appoint an independent scientific auditor to ensure that projects are authorized on the basis of their ability to mitigate actual damages caused by the spill, with special care taken to assess and compensate poorly understood marine impacts. Further, any potential settlement agreement between the responsible party and the trustees should provide for long-term monitoring of affected resources for a period of at least 3 to 5 years, as well as enhancement beyond the baseline. Footnote. Enhancement is a term coined during settlement negotiations after the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989. It requires the responsible party to fund restoration beyond that needed merely to return injured resources to baseline conditions. Rather, any funding should be sufficient to ensure that restoration leaves the affected system better off than before a spill. End footnote. By hewing closely to the in-place and in-kind principles that underpin natural resource damage assessment regulations, trustees will help ensure that injured public resources and the communities that rely on them are made whole to the fullest extent possible, regardless of state and federal boundaries. A focus on ocean impacts will provide an invaluable opportunity, missed during the Ixtoc spill of 1979, to assess and remediate damage to marine ecosystems after an oil spill. 3. The need to address human health impacts, especially among response workers and in affected communities. As described in Chapter 6, the National Contingency Plan overlooks the need to respond to widespread concerns about human health impacts. For smaller oil spills, the response effort is generally carried out by trained oil spill response technicians. But given the scale of the response to the Deepwater Horizon spill and the need to enlist thousands of previously untrained individuals to clean the waters and coastline, many response workers were not screened for pre-existing conditions. This lack of basic medical information, which could have been collected if a short medical questionnaire had been distributed, limits the ability to draw accurate conclusions regarding long-term physical health impacts. Additionally, residents of coastal communities may believe that they suffered adverse health consequences resulting from both chemical exposure from the spill itself and the mental stress occasioned by the spill's assault on their livelihoods. Adequate funding and resources were not in place to deal with claims of physical and mental illness among Gulf Coast residents resulting from or exacerbated by the spill, response actions, and the resulting impacts. Whether allegations that the spill created health problems for responders and Gulf Coast residents are warranted does not change the perception among some that government has not been responsive to health concerns. The National Contingency Plan contains no specific guidance for responding to public health impacts of an oil spill or hazardous substances release. By contrast, the National Response Framework, which provides the structure for a national response to terrorist attacks, major disasters, and other kinds of emergencies, incorporates a protocol for responding to public health exigencies. Recommendation E3. The EPA should develop distinct plans and procedures to address human health impacts during a spill of national significance. EPA should amend the National Contingency Plan to add distinct procedures to address human health impacts during a spill of national significance. Spills of this magnitude necessarily require a significant cleanup effort, potentially exposing workers to toxic compounds in oil and dispersants. Additionally, residents of coastal communities may suffer adverse health consequences due to both chemical exposure from the spill itself and the mental stress occasioned by the assault on their livelihoods or way of life. With respect to worker health and safety, existing authorities should be strengthened to ensure consistent application of medical screening and surveillance procedures for both formal response contractors and ad hoc citizen responders. Regarding public health, a medical services protocol similar to the Public Health and Medical Services Annex of the National Response Framework should be incorporated to ensure emergency medical care, timely dissemination of public health information, and medical monitoring and surveillance. Furthermore, a public health protocol requiring the collection of adequate baseline data and long-term monitoring would allow researchers to assess the human dimensions of oil spills with greater accuracy. Without sound data on the causal or correlative relationships between chemical, i.e. oil and dispersants, exposure, and human health, a number of response methods may be used inappropriately, including the provision of appropriate protective gear for cleanup workers. 4. The need to restore consumer confidence. As described in Chapter 6, images of spewing oil and oiled beaches in newspapers and on television set the stage for public concern regarding the safety of Gulf seafood. Additional factors contributed to the lingering impression that the public could not trust government assurances that the seafood was safe. The unprecedented volumes of dispersants used, confusion over the flow rate and fate of the oil, frustration about the government's relationship with BP in spill cleanup, and lawsuits filed by fishermen contesting the government's assurance of seafood safety. The economic blow to the Gulf region associated with this loss of consumer confidence is sizable. BP gave Louisiana and Florida $68 million for seafood testing and marketing, as well as money to assess impacts on tourism and fund promotional activities. As of early December, BP was considering a similar request from Alabama. In future spills, however, there is no guarantee that a responsible party will have the means or the inclination to compensate such losses. Such indirect financial harms are currently not compensable under the Oil Pollution Act. Nevertheless, losses in consumer confidence are real, and Congress, federal agencies, and responsible parties should consider ways to restore consumer confidence in the aftermath of a spill of national significance. Recommendation E4. Congress, federal agencies, and responsible parties should take steps to restore consumer confidence in the aftermath of a spill of national significance. 5. The need for a long-term restoration effort that is well-funded, scientifically grounded, and responsive to regional needs and public input. As described in Chapter 7, a lack of sustained and predictable funding, together with failed project coordination and long-term planning, have resulted in incomplete and often ineffective efforts to restore the Gulf's natural environment. Currently, no funding source exists to support regional restoration efforts. Estimates of the cost of Gulf restoration vary widely, but according to testimony before the Commission, fully restoring the Gulf will require $15 billion to $20 billion, or a minimum of $500 million per year over 30 years. While a number of different sources currently provide funding to individual states for restoration, none of these sources provides funds for Gulf-wide coastal and marine restoration, and none is sufficient to support the sustained effort required. Most policymakers agree that without a reliable source of long-term funding, it will be impossible to achieve restoration in the Gulf. Several Gulf states and the federal government have filed or are expected to file suit against BP and other companies involved in the spill, which will likely create opportunities to direct new restoration funds to the region. In some cases, congressional action will be required to ensure that funds are directed to this purpose. Meanwhile, Congress has already begun considering other potential funding sources, including a higher per-barrel tax on oil production, increased royalties or fees, and direct appropriations for Gulf-wide restoration through the normal federal budget process. Although many of these proposals face political hurdles, the fact remains that resources are needed if progress on coastal restoration is to continue. Inaction is a prescription for further degradation, since many Gulf ecosystems were already fragile and deteriorating before the spill. Maintaining the status quo amounts to accepting their continued decline, with the longer-term risks and vulnerabilities this entails. In order for funding to be most effectively directed at long-term restoration, a decision-making body is needed that has authority to set binding priorities and criteria for project funding. The Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force is now in place. It was recommended by a September 2010 report on restoration from Secretary of the Navy Ray Mabus to the President, and subsequently established by presidential executive order. According to the language of the executive order, the job of the task force is to begin coordinating the different restoration projects being undertaken by various jurisdictions in the Gulf, coordinating related science activities, and engaging stakeholders. However, as many in Congress and the administration have suggested, the task force lacks some features necessary to effectively direct long-term restoration efforts in the Gulf. Most importantly, the ability to set binding goals and priorities. A number of critical issues remain to be addressed, including how to allocate funding in a way that addresses the relative restoration needs of individual states, how to balance the roles and interests of the state and federal governments, how to ensure that decisions are made efficiently and quickly, how to incorporate good science without unduly slowing valuable projects, and how to incorporate meaningful public input. End of section 28. Section 29 of the final report from the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Kasper. Final report from the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. Chapter 9. Investing in Safety, Investing in Response, Investing in the Gulf. Part 4. Recommendation E5. Congress should dedicate 80% of the Clean Water Act penalties to long-term restoration of the Gulf of Mexico. E6. Congress and federal and state agencies should build the organizational, financial, scientific, and public outreach capacities needed to put the restoration effort on a strong footing. The Commission's recommendations share much common ground with those outlined in Secretary Mabus's report this past September. For instance, the Commission recommends that Congress, recognizing that dedicated, sustained funding is necessary to accomplish long-term Gulf of Mexico ecosystem restoration, should direct 80% of the Clean Water Act penalties to support implementation of a region-wide restoration strategy. Directing such payments to the Gulf could, for the next 10 years, provide significant funding. If litigation arising from the spill results in civil or criminal penalties, a global settlement of litigation should include supplemental environmental projects and community service projects that direct payments to the Gulf. Footnote: Supplemental environmental projects are projects that a defendant agrees to undertake as part of a settlement with government of an enforcement action, and that are above and beyond those necessary to comply with applicable legal requirements. End footnote. Should Clean Water Act penalties not be redirected toward Gulf ecosystem restoration, Congress should consider other mechanisms for a dedicated funding stream not subject to annual appropriations. The Commission recommends that Congress establish a joint state-federal Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Council. The structure of the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council should inform the structure of the Gulf Coast Council on the question of the relative representation of the federal and state governments on the council. The Gulf Coast Council should implement a restoration strategy for the region that is compatible with existing state restoration goals. The strategy should set long and short-term goals with criteria for selecting projects for funding. Key criteria should include 1. National significance, 2. Contribution to achieving ecosystem resilience, and 3. The extent to which national policies, such as related to flood control, oil and gas development, agriculture, and navigation, directly contributed to the environmental problem. Experience in major restoration endeavors, including those in the Gulf, has shown that, absent binding goals to drive the process, restoration projects are insufficiently funded, focused, or coordinated. Establishing a region-wide council to coordinate agency activities represents a necessary first step, but without authority to set priorities and resolve conflicts, such a council will be hampered in its ability to achieve environmental goals. The Commission recommends that a region-wide council for the Gulf be given authority to set priorities that will govern the expenditure of funds and resolve any conflicts regarding eligibility of projects. The Council should further define specific categories of projects that could meet each of the 3 criteria listed above. Projects could be categorized in a number of ways, for example, by habitat, key estuaries, seagrass, wetlands, coral reefs; by goal, biological productivity and ecosystem function, improving resilience, restoring fisheries; or by specific project type, river diversion, beach nourishment. The Commission believes that having a comprehensive binding strategy to guide the restoration effort is critical to success. By elaborating on the goals set by the governing entity, and by providing specific milestones and restoration objectives, such a strategy would focus the overall effort and help ensure that projects are not duplicative. The strategy could also include a map that ties projects to specific places and provide a useful mechanism for public involvement. Congress should also ensure that the priorities and decisions of the Gulf Coast Council are informed by input from a Citizens Advisory Council that represents diverse stakeholders. Finally, but essentially, restoration decisions must be rooted in science. An approach that draws heavily on information and advice from scientists will result in project selection and funding allocations that are more likely to lead to an effective region-wide restoration strategy. It will also advance transparency in decision-making and enhance credibility with the public. The Commission accordingly recommends the establishment of a Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Science and Technology Program that would address these issues in 3 ways. 1. By creating a scientific research and analysis program supported by the Restoration Fund that is designed to support the design of scientifically sound restoration projects. 2. By creating a science panel to evaluate individual projects for technical effectiveness and consistency with the comprehensive strategy. And 3. By supporting adaptive management plans based on monitoring of outcomes scaled both to the strategy itself and to the individual projects or categories of projects included in it. 6. The need for better tools to balance economic and environmental interests in the Gulf. Federal agencies charged with managing activities within the U.S. exclusive economic zone have tended to work largely in isolation from one another. Responsive to the recommendations of the 2004 U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy, President Obama in June 2009 directed 24 federal departments and agencies to provide in-depth recommendations about how federal policy can address inefficiencies in the nation's traditionally ad hoc management of its seas. The Interagency Ocean Policy Task Force reported in the summer of 2010. Its recommendations were subsequently included in a presidential executive order issued on July 15, 2010, that created a new National Ocean Council to coordinate federal marine policy. Prominent recommendations included a requirement that key regional and federal authorities develop and implement coastal and marine spatial planning for ocean users and the public. This system is designed to optimize marine productivity. More broadly, scientific advice grounded in peer-reviewed empirical research inform strategy and decision-making in ocean management, including for energy, shipping, national defense, sustainable fisheries, and conservation. Recommendation E7. The appropriate federal agencies, including EPA, Interior, and NOAA, and the trustees for natural resources, should better balance the myriad economic and environmental interests concentrated in the Gulf region going forward. This would include improved monitoring and increased use of sophisticated tools like coastal and marine spatial planning. Many of these tools and capacities will also be important to manage areas of the OCS outside the Gulf. The Commission recommends that as part of management and restoration efforts in the marine environment, greater attention should be given to new tools for managing ocean resources, including monitoring systems and spatial planning. Marine scientists have emerged from the Deepwater Horizon incident with more precise questions to investigate and a better sense of monitoring needs in the Gulf of Mexico, which, because of its multiple uses and economic value, should be a national priority. To that end, the National Ocean Council should work with the responsible federal agencies, industry, and the scientific community to expand the Gulf of Mexico Integrated Ocean Observing System, including the installation and maintenance of an in situ network of instruments deployed on selected production platforms. Participation in this system by industry should be regarded as a reasonable part of doing business in the nation's waters. Coastal and marine spatial planning has the potential to improve overall efficiency and reduce conflicts among ocean users. Congress should grant funds for the development of regional planning bodies at the amount requested by the President in the fiscal year 2011 budget submitted to Congress. Ocean management should also include more strategically sited marine protected areas, including but not limited to the national marine sanctuaries, which can be used as mitigation banks to help offset harm to the marine environment. Given the economic and cultural importance of fishing in the Gulf region and the importance of Gulf seafood to the rest of the country, scientifically valid measures, such as catch-share programs, should be developed to prevent overfishing and ensure the continuity of robust fisheries. Marine spatial planning was designed to ensure that myriad ocean management decisions are compatible and consistent, that they make sense. In the decades since marine protection began, scientists have developed a much more robust understanding of the Gulf's physical and ecological processes. Now, for example, marine protected areas can be used and should be used to ensure the continuity and robustness of fisheries into the future. Rationalizing ocean use around this much improved scientific understanding, for example, by identifying which parts of the ocean are appropriate or inappropriate for certain uses, should serve to maximize the productivity of natural systems and end inefficient or harmful practices that have accumulated over time. F. Ensuring financial responsibility. As described in Chapter 6, oil spills cause a range of harms, both economic and environmental, to individuals and ecosystems. The Oil Pollution Act makes the party responsible for a spill liable for compensating those who suffered as a result of the spill through property damage, lost profits, and other economic injuries, and for restoring injured natural resources. The Act also provides an opportunity to make claims for compensation from a dedicated Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. The Oil Pollution Act, however, imposes limits on both the amount for which the responsible party is liable and the amount of compensation available through the trust fund. In the case of the Deepwater Horizon spill, BP, a responsible party, has placed $20 billion in escrow to compensate private individuals and businesses through the independent Gulf Coast Claims Facility. But if a less well-capitalized company had caused the spill, neither a multi-billion-dollar compensation fund nor the funds necessary to restore injured resources would likely have been available. It is critical that compensation to victims be paid in full, and that the process for receiving compensation is swift and efficient. The Commission offers recommendations that would increase assurances that responsible parties are able to compensate victims, and at the same time strengthens incentives to prevent accidents in the first place, and that the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund provide any compensation not provided by the responsible parties. It also recommends a close review of the Gulf Coast Claims Facility process to determine its effectiveness in adjudicating compensation claims and its value as a model for future spills of national significance. 1. The need to increase existing limitations on responsible party liability. Liability for damages from spills from offshore facilities is capped under the Oil Pollution Act at $75 million, unless it can be shown that the responsible party was guilty of gross negligence or willful misconduct, violated a federal safety regulation, or failed to report the incident or cooperate with removal activities, in which case there is no limit on damages. See Chapter 8. Claims up to $1 billion above the $75 million cap for certain damages can be made to and paid out of the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, which is currently supported by an 8-cent per barrel tax on domestic and imported oil. The Oil Pollution Act also requires responsible parties to establish and maintain evidence of financial responsibility, generally based on a worst-case discharge estimate. In the case of offshore facilities, generally financial responsibility ranges from $35 million to $150 million. The financial responsibility requirement provides a direct link between the Oil Pollution Act and insurance, as the Act provides that financial responsibility may be established by any one or by any combination of the following methods, if determined by the Secretary of the Interior to be acceptable: evidence of insurance, surety bond, guarantee, letter of credit, qualification as a self-insurer, or other evidence of financial responsibility. There are two main problems with the current liability cap and financial responsibility dollar amounts: lack of adequate safety incentives. A threshold problem with any damages cap that limits liability well below levels that may actually be incurred is that such a cap distorts the incentives of industry participants to adopt cost-effective safety precautions. Decisions regarding safety precautions are made for a variety of reasons, some of which cannot be influenced by policy measures. The relatively modest liability cap and financial responsibility requirements provide little incentive for oil companies to improve safety practices. Inadequate damages compensation. BP's damages from the Deepwater Horizon spill will total in the tens of billions of dollars. The company has already paid claims that measure in the billions and has waived the statutory $75 million cap, but there is no guarantee that other companies in the future will agree to waive the cap. And if an oil company with more limited financial means than BP had caused the Deepwater Horizon spill, that company might well have declared bankruptcy long before paying fully for all damages. In the case of a large spill, the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund would likely not provide sufficient backup. Thus, a significant portion of the injuries caused to individuals and natural resources, as well as government response costs, could go uncompensated. Any discussion of increasing liability caps and financial responsibility requirements must balance two competing public policy concerns. First, the goal of ensuring that the risk of major spills is minimized, and in the event of a spill, victims are fully compensated. And second, that increased caps and financial responsibility requirements do not drive competent independent oil companies out of the market. A realistic policy solution also requires an understanding of the host of complex economic impacts that could result from increases to liability caps and financial responsibility requirements. Recommendation F1. Congress should significantly increase the liability cap and financial responsibility requirements for offshore facilities. To address both the incentive and compensation concerns noted above, Congress should significantly raise the liability cap. Financial responsibility limits should also be increased, because if an oil company does not have adequate resources to pay for a spill, the application of increased liability has little effect. Should a company go bankrupt before fully compensating for a spill, its liability is effectively capped. If, however, the level of liability imposed and the level of financial responsibility required are set to levels that bear some relationship to potential damages, firms will have greater incentives to maximize prevention and minimize potential risk of oil spills. and also have the financial means to ensure that victims of spills do not go uncompensated. Legislative attempts to raise the cap and financial responsibility requirements to significantly higher levels have been met with the argument that these changes will cause insurance carriers to drop oil pollution coverage, leading to an exodus of small and independent companies from the offshore drilling market. The counter-argument is that oil companies should bear the social costs of their activities, and if those costs are too large or unpredictable to be insurable, then it is appropriate that these companies exit the market. There is legitimacy to aspects of both arguments. A company should not be able to cause billions of dollars of damage and walk away simply because its operations contribute to the economy of the Gulf. Nor should smaller companies that can demonstrate the ability to drill safely and to pay for damages resulting from a large spill be forced out of the market. However, smaller companies that cannot demonstrate financial responsibility and meet risk requirements set and monitored by the Department of the Interior or a third party should not be allowed to make others pay for the costs of their accidents. One option for keeping competent independents in the market is a mutual insurance pool. Under such an arrangement, individual companies engaged in offshore drilling would pay premiums into a pool, which would pay out damages caused by a company as a result of a spill. A possible downside is that the mutual pool could have the effect of undercutting incentives individual firms might otherwise have to improve safety practices. But this problem could be addressed, for example, by tying premium levels to the financial and safety risk posed by an individual company's activities. This option would allow companies to demonstrate financial responsibility for the cost of spills, at least to the limit paid out by the pool. Another option would be to phase in increases in the liability cap and financial responsibility requirements, which would allow the insurance industry a period of adjustment. Although any increase in liability limits and financial responsibility requirements would test the capacity of the offshore drilling insurance market, over time, such a change would almost certainly stimulate an increase in insurance capacity. A phased-in approach would allow Congress to reassess any concerns about limited capacity in the insurance industry in light of actual experience. Finally, regardless of how insurance is provided, smaller firms should be encouraged to partner with firms of greater financial resources. It should be noted that joint ventures between larger and smaller companies already exist. Thus, a policy change may not be necessary to encourage such arrangements. 2. The need to increase limitations on payments from the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. If liability and financial responsibility limits are not set at a level that will ensure payment of all damages for spills, then another source of funding will be required to ensure full compensation. The federal government could cover additional compensation costs, but this approach requires the taxpayer to foot the bill. Therefore, Congress should raise the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund per incident limit, because the current limits are clearly inadequate. Recommendation F2. Congress should increase the limit on per incident payouts from the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. Raising the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund's per incident limit will require the fund to grow through an increase of the per barrel tax on domestic and imported oil production. An alternative would be to increase the trust fund through a surcharge by mandatory provisions in drilling leases, triggered in the event that there are inadequate sums available in the fund. An increase in the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund's per incident limit would not provide an incentive to offshore facilities to mitigate risks, because risks are pooled and the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund is funded by parties other than those who engage in offshore drilling activities. But raising the limit would help ensure that victims have access to compensation without the need to seek further specific funding from Congress or otherwise burdening the taxpayer. 3. The need for better auditing and monitoring of risk. The Interior Department currently determines financial responsibility levels based on potential worst-case discharges as required by the Oil Pollution Act. Although the agency's analysis to some degree accounts for the risk associated with individual drilling activities, it does not fully account for the range of factors that could affect the cost of a spill, and thus the level of financial responsibility that should be required. Interior should analyze a host of specific risk-related criteria when determining financial responsibility limits applicable to a particular company, including but not limited to geological and environmental considerations, the applicant's experience and expertise, and applicable risk management plans. This increased scrutiny would provide an additional guard against unqualified companies entering the offshore drilling market. Recommendation F3. The Department of the Interior should enhance auditing and evaluation of the risk of offshore drilling activities by individual participants, operator, driller, other service companies. The Department of the Interior, insurance underwriters, or other independent entities should evaluate and monitor the risk of offshore drilling activities to promote enhanced risk management in offshore operations and to discourage unqualified companies from remaining in the market. If liability and financial responsibility limits are raised, increased liabilities will be borne by insurance carriers, which will have a strong incentive to promote new safety techniques and methods, as well as to monitor risk. Insurance carriers might insist on certification of operators by an independent entity devoted to identifying the best safety practices and monitoring risk, such as a self-policing safety organization for the oil and gas industry, as recommended in Chapter 8. Insurers or a self-policing safety organization for the industry also could provide a guard against unqualified companies entering the offshore drilling market. 4. The need for assessment of the existing claims process. The Oil Pollution Act holds the responsible party liable for private claims brought by individuals or businesses for removal costs and certain damages. All claims must first be presented to the responsible party. But if the responsible party denies a claim, the claimant may pursue an in-court action or present an uncompensated claim for payment to the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. The Gulf Coast Claims Facility, which is independently administered on behalf of BP, the responsible party, has established a claims processing mechanism that attempts to resolve claims against the responsible party outside of the courts. Kenneth Feinberg, formerly Special Master for the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, administers the $20 billion escrow account through the claims facility. Eligible claims include 1. Removal and cleanup costs, 2. Physical damages to real or personal property, 3. Lost profits or impairment of earning capacity, 4. Loss of subsistence use of natural resources, and 5. Physical injury or death. The facility does not pay claims brought by the government or related to real estate, the moratorium, or the Vessel of Opportunity program. To date, some claimants have been dissatisfied with decisions to deny certain claims and with the amount and timeliness of compensation received from approved claims, which has required Feinberg to reconsider the rules and processes in place for reimbursement. The United States Department of Justice sent a letter to Feinberg on September 17, 2010, urging expediency. In response, the claims facility noted that the large number of fraudulent and undocumented claims have slowed the process. Nonetheless, after the September 17th letter, Feinberg made several adjustments to the program, including streamlining processing time and removing geographic proximity to the oil spill as bar against payment. Feinberg also extended the time frame within which claimants could receive interim payments without waiving their right to pursue litigation. As of December 11, 2010, the claims facility has paid more than $2.4 billion in claims to more than 164,000 claimants. The Commission believes it would be useful to evaluate the effectiveness of the claims facility as a means of informing the compensation process in future large spills. Recommendation F4. The Department of Justice's Office of Dispute Resolution should conduct an evaluation of the Gulf Coast Claims Facility once all claims have been paid out, in order to inform claims processes in future spills of national significance. The evaluation should include a review of the process, the guidelines used for compensation, and the success rate for avoiding lawsuits. G. Promoting congressional engagement to ensure responsible offshore drilling. The Commission's recommendations in this report include some directed to Congress for specific legislation, and others directed to various specific federal agencies, responsible parties, and the oil and gas industry in general. The several recommendations directed to Congress, however, also highlight a further lesson: the need for Congress to engage more systematically in ensuring the safety of drilling in the OCS and environmental protection. This includes more active congressional oversight, and also includes congressional action to ensure that those in government responsible for safety oversight and environmental protection review have the resources necessary to do their jobs. To that end, this final set of recommendations addresses the need for Congress itself to take affirmative steps to ensure responsible offshore drilling. 1. The need for congressional awareness and engagement. In the years between the Exxon Valdez spill and the spring of 2010, Congress, like much of the nation, appears to have developed a false sense of security about the risks of offshore oil and gas development. Congress showed its support for offshore drilling in a number of ways, but did not take any steps to mitigate the increased perils that accompany drilling in ever deeper water. Until the Deepwater Horizon exploded, 11 rig workers lost their lives, and millions of barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico, Congress had not introduced legislation to address the risks of deepwater drilling. The congressional committee structure makes it much harder to focus on safety and environmental issues associated with offshore oil and gas development. In the 111th Congress, multiple committees in both chambers claimed jurisdiction over offshore energy development. The House Natural Resources Committee, for example, had jurisdiction over mineral land laws and claims and entries thereunder, and mineral resources of public lands. Its subcommittee on energy and mineral resources was specifically charged with oversight of conservation and development of oil and gas resources of the outer continental shelf. But the House Committee on Energy and Commerce oversaw exploration, production, storage, supply, marketing, pricing, and regulation of energy resources, including all fossil fuels, as well as national energy policy generally. Similarly, the jurisdiction of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources included extraction of minerals from oceans and outer continental shelf lands, and its Subcommittee on Energy was responsible for oversight of oil and natural gas regulation generally. By contrast, the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works claimed oversight over environmental aspects of outer continental shelf lands. Yet during the 110th and 111th Congresses, none of the subcommittees of Environment and Public Works claimed oversight specifically over OCS lands issues. In neither the House nor the Senate are any of these committees charged with directly overseeing the safety and environmental impacts of offshore development, separate from the conflicting goal of resource development and royalties. The House Committee on Education and Labor and the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions both emphasize occupational safety and health, but neither committee appears to focus on process safety, the vital approach identified by this commission's investigation that encompasses procedures for minimizing adverse events such as effective hazard analysis, management of risk, communication, and auditing. Finally, no oversight of any of these matters has been conducted by any of the several House or Senate committees or subcommittees responsible for the nation's tax policies or overall appropriations process, notwithstanding the significant impact those policies and appropriations have on both the extent of energy industry activities on the OCS and the government's ability to oversee that activity effectively. After the Deepwater Horizon explosion and resulting oil spill, numerous committees took an interest in offshore safety and environmental issues and held hearings. In short, it took a catastrophe to attract congressional attention. Recommendation G1. Increase and maintain congressional awareness of the risks of offshore drilling in two ways. First, create additional congressional oversight of offshore safety and environmental risks. Second, require the appropriate congressional committees to hold an annual oversight hearing on the state of technology, application of process safety, and environmental protection to ensure these issues receive continuing congressional attention. The House and Senate Rules Committee should each assign a specific committee or subcommittee to oversee process safety and environmental issues related to offshore energy development. These committees should also be given the task of overseeing the Offshore Safety Authority, the creation of which this commission has separately recommended. Congress should require the Secretary of the Interior to submit an annual public report on energy offshore development activities to the applicable congressional committees. This report should focus on the department's progress in improving its prescriptive safety regulations, steps taken by industry and the department to improve facility management, the department's progress in implementing a stronger environmental assessment program, including developing improved NEPA guidelines, and on any other steps taken by industry or the department to address safety and environmental concerns offshore. The report should also detail the industry's safety and environmental record during the previous 12 months. Finally, the report should highlight any areas in which the department believes industry is not doing all that it can to promote safety and the environment, and any areas where additional legislation could be helpful to the department's efforts. Congress should require the Department of the Interior's Office of the Inspector General to submit an independent annual public report to the applicable congressional committees. The report should provide an independent description of the Offshore Safety Authority's activities over the previous 12 months, including its efforts to improve offshore safety and to investigate accidents and other significant offshore incidents. The report should also include the Inspector General's evaluation of the authority's efforts and the Inspector General's recommendations for improvement. 2. The need for adequate funding for safety oversight and environmental review. Many of the earlier recommendations require adequate congressional funding in order to be implemented effectively. For instance, the new Offshore Safety Authority at Interior cannot be expected to succeed in meaningfully overseeing the oil and gas industry if Congress does not ensure that it has the resources to do so. Agencies cannot conduct the scientific and environmental research necessary to evaluate impacts of offshore development if they do not receive adequate support from Congress. In short, Congress needs to make funding the agencies regulating offshore oil and gas development a priority in order to ensure a safer and more environmentally responsible industry in future. BOE-MRE currently receives a portion of its funding from offsetting collections from industry. In its fiscal year 2011 budget justification, it requested that just less than half of its budget, $174.9 million, come from these collections. The oil and gas industry, however, should do significantly more and provide the funds necessary for regulation of offshore oil and gas operations and oil spill preparedness planning. The amount of funding needs to keep pace as industry moves into ever more challenging depths and geologic formations, because the related challenges of regulatory oversight likewise increase. This could be accomplished many different ways. Congress could, for instance, raise the inspection fees already imposed on facilities operating on the OCS, currently offsetting about 3% of BOE-MRE's annual budget, or impose a differently based annual regulatory fee on new and existing licenses. Or Congress could instruct the Department of Interior to include lease provisions that require the imposition of regulatory fees. Interior already possesses broad authority to include in leases such rental and other provisions as the Secretary may prescribe at the time of offering the area for lease. No matter the precise mechanism, the oil and gas industry would be required to pay for its regulators, just as fees on the telecommunications industry support the Federal Communications Commission. Regulation of the oil and gas industry would no longer be funded by taxpayers, but instead by the industry that is being permitted to have access to a publicly owned resource. Future Congresses would therefore have less incentive to reduce agency funding. Recommendation G2. Congress should enact legislation creating a mechanism for offshore oil and gas operators to provide ongoing and regular funding of the agencies regulating offshore oil and gas development. The President asked this commission to recommend not only improvements to federal laws, regulations, and industry practices applicable to offshore drilling, but also organizational or other reforms of federal agencies or processes necessary to ensure such improvements are implemented and maintained. In carrying out this charge, the Commission has been mindful of the dangers of fighting the last war, that is, addressing the specific failures revealed by the Deepwater Horizon disaster, but neglecting to anticipate future problems whose contours are yet unknown. Our recommendations for a new approach to risk assessment and management, a new independent agency responsible for safety and environmental review of offshore drilling, stronger environmental review and enforcement, a reorientation of spill response and containment planning, and a revision of liability rules to better protect victims and provide proper incentives to industry, aim to establish an oversight regime that is sufficiently strong, expert, well-resourced, and flexible to prevent the next disaster, not the last. The oil and gas industry, remarkable for its technological innovation and productivity, needs government oversight and regulation that can keep pace. End of section 29.
Section 30 of the final report from the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Dorr. Final report from the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. Chapter 10, American Energy Policy and the Future of Offshore Drilling. Introduction. The BP Deepwater Horizon disaster undermined public faith in the oil and gas industry, in government regulators, and even in America's ability to respond to crises. The disaster raised serious questions about our nation's ability to manage and protect for current and future generations the invaluable natural resources of the outer continental shelf and the multiple uses they sustain, the patrimony of all Americans. Based on the Commission's thorough and vigorous accounting of this tragedy, the central lesson to be drawn from the catastrophe is that no less than an overhauling of both current industry practices and government oversight is now required. The changes necessary will be transformative in their depth and breadth, requiring an unbending commitment to safety by government and industry to displace a culture of complacency. Drilling in deep water does not have to be abandoned. It can be done safely. That is one of the central messages of this report. The reforms proposed herein are intended to do for this industry what new policies and practices have done for other high-risk industries after their disasters. The potential for such a transformation to ensure productive, safe, and responsible offshore drilling is significant and provides reason for optimism even in the wake of a disaster. The significance of the Deepwater Horizon disaster, however, is broader than just its relevance to the future of offshore drilling. The disaster signals the need to consider the broader context of the nation's patterns of energy production and use, now and in the future, the elements of America's energy policy. The explosion at the Macondo well and the ensuing enormous spill, particularly jarring events because of the belief they could never happen, force a re-examination of many widely held assumptions about how to reconcile the risks and benefits of offshore drilling, and a candid reassessment of the nation's policies for the development of a valuable resource. They also support a broader re-examination of the nation's overall energy policy. Offshore oil and gas will continue to be an important part of the nation's domestic energy supply for many decades. Offshore wells yield 1/3 of current U.S. oil production, and in recent decades helped offset declines in production elsewhere in the United States. U.S. production peaked in 1970. That already crucial role is likely to increase. The area of federal jurisdiction, the Outer Continental Shelf, contains an estimated 85 billion barrels of oil in technically recoverable resources, more than all onshore resources and those in the shallower state waters combined. The future of domestic oil production will rely to a substantial extent on current Outer Continental Shelf sources and further development of deposits there, in progressively deeper, more distant waters, and perhaps in such challenging environs as the Alaskan Arctic. Whether we explore for and produce oil and gas from those prospective reserves, and if so, under what conditions, depends crucially on taking to heart the lessons we learn from the Deepwater Horizon disaster and the energy policies we put in place. Important decisions about whether, when, where, and how to engage in offshore drilling cannot be made wisely if they are made in a vacuum. Policies about offshore drilling should be powerfully shaped by economic, security, pace of technology, safety, and environmental concerns. Offshore drilling will certainly be an important part of any national energy policy, but it is only a part of the picture, and its relative importance today will not and should not be the same a half-century from now. The nation must begin a transition to a cleaner, more energy-efficient future. Non-renewable oil and gas resources are just that, non-renewable, which means any nation forging an energy policy for the future must develop the technologies that provide maximum energy efficiency and create renewable substitutes. Otherwise, the nation's security and well-being will be increasingly dependent on diminishing supplies of non-renewable resources, and even more dependent on supplies from foreign sources. Domestic consumption of oil has exceeded domestic production since the late 1940s, making the country increasingly dependent on imports, which now supply about 52% of U.S. needs, compared to 42% in 1990. In the near term, oil from federal offshore lands helps moderate America's dependence on imported supplies, lessening the current trade deficit and contributing to national security. The government also reaps significant revenues from the leasing of federal lands and the collection of royalties on production, typically billions of dollars per year. The development of offshore energy resources contributes substantially to local economies, supporting businesses small and large, and employing tens of thousands of workers. But any sensible energy policy must recognize the substantial risks that accompany these real benefits, in addition to the dangers of an economy and national security dependent on non-renewable energy supplies. The impressive technologies developed for offshore drilling and production have not been accompanied by comparable improvements in safety and environmental protection. As Americans now know, 3 major companies failed to apply rigorous process safety measures to their drilling operations in the Gulf of Mexico. Halliburton and Transocean, which service drilling operations throughout the Gulf, along with BP, underscoring the systematic nature of the offshore industry's problems. This commission has documented and explained these tragic failures, and in this report has recommended a comprehensive integrated set of reforms required to improve the performance of the offshore oil and gas industry, as appropriately overseen by an effective regulatory authority. A safe, offshore oil and gas industry matters, both because the costs of needlessly risky behavior are so high and because the nation is so dependent on offshore energy supplies. In light of present knowledge, inaction is a policy of dangerous default, of continuing to rely on chance and luck to avoid a next time. American citizens will demand and will hold the oil and gas industry and government officials responsible for creating the conditions under which a robust offshore oil and gas industry can operate safely and coexist with human health, environmental protection, and other economic activities, weighing national security, the economy, human safety, and the environment. In contemporary America, petroleum is woven into every aspect of our lives. The continuous availability of oil products, gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel powers the mobility that has become key to a strong economy. Military operations, the movement of food and other commercial products, and personal travel would all grind to a halt without oil, at least as our society is organized today. Yet growing demand for oil around the world, particularly in the huge and rapidly developing economies of Asia, ensures heightened competition for supplies, putting upward pressure on oil prices. That poses a long-term challenge for the United States, which is not and cannot be self-sufficient in oil supply. At the same time, scientific evidence has continued to mount on the interconnections among the use of all carbon-based fuels, including oil and natural gas, the growing concentrations of greenhouse gases, and global climate change. Energy policy thus embraces considerations of national security, the economy, environmental protection, the need to limit climate change, the pace of development of renewable energy sources and non-petroleum dependent vehicles, human health and safety, and unique regional conditions. Security and petroleum resources. The major American security risk derives from oil's predominant role in transportation. 72% of oil consumed in the United States in 2009 was used for transportation, and 94% of transportation relied on oil. As the National Academy of Sciences recently concluded, the nation, quote, needs to lower its dependence on fragile supply chains for some energy sources, particularly petroleum at present and possibly natural gas in the future, and to avoid the impacts of this dependence on our nation's economy and national security, end quote. The good news is that energy-efficient technologies exist today that can in the near term moderate the nation's demand for oil and change the mix of supplies of electricity and energy over time. But changing existing reliance on oil in general, and oil imports in particular, will require a major overhaul of our energy and transportation systems, a challenging shift that would require strong public leadership and would take decades to effect even if we agreed on the course of action tomorrow. Recent events have made clear the magnitude of the stakes. The United States has repeatedly been surprised by sudden interruptions in the oil supply from various unexpected events, underscoring the nation's potential vulnerability. These include politically motivated production cuts by oil exporting countries, the oil embargo of 1973 to 1974, border wars between oil exporters, between Iraq and Iran in 1980-1988, and Iraq and Kuwait in 1990 to 1991. Strife and unrest within several oil exporting countries, and severe weather events affecting offshore oil production or coastal refineries. Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005 and Ike in 2008, all in the Gulf of Mexico. Energy planners also worry about the possibility that the Straits of Hormuz, the only sea passage to the open ocean for the bulk of Persian Gulf petroleum exports, could be closed, or that a major oil pipeline somewhere in the world could be ruptured by accident or attack. Even absent an actual interruption in supplies, our reliance on foreign oil is a national security concern. Hostile exporting nations can use the threat of interrupting supplies to pressure the United States. Money spent on foreign oil can also end up in the hands of terrorists or be used to build nuclear or develop biological weapons in nations flouting the international atomic and biological regulatory regimes. The ultimate nightmare would be an America depleted of petroleum, which has failed to make a sufficient transition to alternative sources, facing another Pearl Harbor or the aftershocks of 9/11. Since Colonel Drake first struck oil at his Pennsylvania site in 1859, the United States has already extracted over 200 billion barrels of oil from its territory, more than our estimated remaining reserves. The United States did not relinquish its position as the world's leading producer until 1974, but now it finds itself credited with only 1.4% of the world's proved oil reserves, while consuming 22% of the global supply annually. The use of advanced extraction technologies and a relatively favorable investment climate have enabled the United States to remain the world's third largest oil producer, despite its relatively meager reserves. Would the country's security interests be better served by developing domestic oil resources as rapidly as possible, or by reserving some for future generations? President Harry Truman argued that federal offshore oil resources should become part of the Naval Petroleum Reserve System, leaving the oil in the ground for later development. See Chapter 3. In recent decades, the concept of the Naval Petroleum Reserve has been superseded by a more readily accessible Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which currently contains more than 700 million barrels of unrefined crude oil stored in Louisiana and Texas salt caverns along the Gulf Coast, where it is available for national emergencies, such as sudden disruptions of supply. That provides some insurance, but only about 75 days of supply at the current rate of U.S. imports, and clearly not sufficient to displace any long-term decline in domestic production or respond to a spike in demand. The United States has kept some areas of the outer continental shelf off limits for oil and gas production to protect their unique and valuable environmental characteristics, to avoid incurring risks to major industries such as fishing and tourism, or to maintain open waters for testing of military armaments and training exercises over the Gulf. One way of viewing these areas where drilling is prohibited, Atlantic coast, eastern Gulf of Mexico and Florida coast, and the coasts of Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, is as energy sources held in reserve. National economic implications. The domestic oil and gas sector is a major employer, particularly in fuel-producing regions. Fluctuations in oil and gas prices generally pass quickly through to energy-intensive sectors of the economy: trucking, airlines, agriculture, and petrochemicals such as plastics. Although energy's share of the economy has diminished in recent decades, Americans paid $740 billion for oil and gas products in 2007, and energy prices still have a major impact on inflation. Because oil and gas behave and are traded as commodities, their prices can undergo large changes even apart from immediate supply and demand factors. This volatility from all sources can make it difficult for businesses and individuals to plan and adhere to their budgets for energy costs. Price jolts stemming from undependable supplies can have major adverse effects on the whole economy. Economists Hillard Huntington and Stephen Brown have found that, quote, historical experience shows that the gross domestic product, GDP, losses associated with oil supply shocks can be considerable, end quote. Most strikingly, they noted that 10 of the 11 U.S. recessions since World War II were preceded by sharply rising oil prices. Given Americans' consumption of petroleum products in excess of domestic supply, the country runs a staggering trade imbalance. Between 2004 and 2009, the U.S. trade balance for oil and gas ranged between negative $186 billion and negative $414 billion per year, typically exceeding the much-publicized trade deficit with China. Economic theories of comparative advantage may suggest that particular trade deficits are not worrisome, but the large sustained trade deficit incurred to import petroleum, particularly, makes energy a significant factor in America's overall trade, deficit, and financing strategies and challenges. Environmental and safety challenges. This report has documented in painful detail the far-reaching environmental consequences of catastrophic accidents involving the extraction of oil from offshore sources and the associated risks to workers' safety from drilling, refinery operations, and the emergency cleanup of spills. Further environmental damage occurs when oil products are used as transportation fuels. Emissions released when fuel is burned are generally controlled under federal law, but can still, in combination with emissions from combustion to generate electricity, create conditions that can cause serious health consequences for the American public and serious ecological consequences for our natural systems, forests, and waters. And the combustion of all fossil-based carbon fuels, oil, gas, and coal, has long-term impacts on the increasing volume of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the warming climate. Transportation fuels contribute 1/3 of U.S. carbon emissions, making them the nation's second largest source contributing to climate change. Criteria for balanced energy policy. Reconciling the multiple, sometimes conflicting aims that underlie any transportation-related American petroleum energy policy depends on 6 criteria: maintaining a sufficient reserve of petroleum to protect American national security should access to foreign sources be lost or become unreliable; requiring energy-efficient automobiles and other vehicles, among other sources of consumption, to reduce fuel use and promoting energy-efficient transit alternatives; promoting the development of clean and domestically produced alternative fuels or sources of power for transportation; managing the inherent risks of domestic production of oil and gas, including from offshore areas, while considering the short and long-term availability of these fuels; requiring safe operations to protect human health; and protecting the natural environment, including steps to limit climate change. Reasonable people can disagree about the relative importance of these criteria, and have over time. President Truman ordered a postponement of mineral development on the outer continental shelf in order to ensure oil and gas would be there later for strategic purposes. During the 1970s, Congress adopted legislation to maximize environmental protection and then to expand energy production, as discussed in Chapter 3, but over the long term, none can be pursued to the exclusion of the others. It is notable, moreover, that various policies have had significant effects on U.S. energy use and production. For example, the country has achieved intermittent but sizable increases in automobiles' fuel efficiency, major reductions in tailpipe emissions from gasoline-fueled vehicles, and less reliance on oil to generate electricity. At several points during the past 4 decades, consumption of oil in the United States actually declined for several years, in some cases reflecting adverse economic conditions, and in others, successful public policies and adoption of technological advances. The United States today pursues many discrete policies bearing on all of these issues: vehicle fuel efficiency standards, subsidies for ethanol production for fuel, research into alternative fuels, varying incentives for production of electricity by wind and solar power, and so on. In the aggregate, they are, de facto, the nation's energy policy, but they do not constitute a comprehensive, coherent strategy, such as recently called for by both the National Research Council and the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, one that encompasses all of these elements, identifies trade-offs and priorities, and implements them through incentives, investments in research and development, regulations, and tax policy. Difficult though it may be to arrive at such a consensus, it would provide guidance on balancing the risks and rewards of oil and gas development in especially challenging or sensitive locations, offshore or elsewhere. It is possible and imperative to manage that balance over time for offshore development of oil and gas as part of that overall policy. Learning from the Macondo disaster, the Gulf of Mexico. This report describes in great detail what went wrong on the Deepwater Horizon and in the drilling of the Macondo well, and the well blowout's staggering cost. As the nation considers exploring for and producing energy from offshore frontiers, we have a new opportunity to do things right. Some of those frontiers are in deeper waters or unexplored areas of the Gulf of Mexico. Others are at the far extreme of the country in both distance and climate in Alaska. Improving safety and environmental integrity immediately. It will take several years to fully implement the stringent new safety regime this commission has recommended. Essential changes from doing business as usual in the Gulf of Mexico. But it is not necessary to put deepwater drilling on hold until all the changes are in place. The national and regional energy and economic imperatives can be reconciled effectively with the equally urgent needs to assure human safety and environmental integrity in the Gulf context, now and in the long term. Several benchmarks must be met for exploratory drilling to resume on existing leases and for operations to begin on new ones. Operators must assure that better practices for maintaining well integrity and the isolation of hydrocarbons are used at all times, and they must insist upon heightened vigilance throughout all the steps, from the inception of well design to the consideration of changes during drilling operations. Similarly, protocols for testing of blowout preventers must be put in place and enforced. The industry must also demonstrate that it is deploying readily available and effective systems for containment and response. As the energy industry works to satisfy these requirements, the Department of the Interior must work promptly to reorganize its divisions, augment its regulatory staff, and enhance their skill. The American public has every reason to insist that Congress provide regulators with adequate resources to do their vital job, and that the industry apply its resources and expertise to improving practices. Both must focus on the substantial challenges of making offshore drilling safe, reliable, and productive. The circumstances demand a shared commitment by government and industry to work for immediate and long-term reforms that allow deepwater exploratory drilling to resume quickly and safely. And to that end, industries should be ready to pay fees as part of their lease agreements in order to ensure that government overseers have the resources required to get the job done in a rigorous and timely fashion. Emerging challenges from ultra-deepwater drilling. That shared commitment must extend beyond current conditions. While correcting the many problems revealed at the Macondo well, both industry and government must anticipate and adjust to new challenges arising in the Gulf. Current technology enables drilling in water twice as deep as Macondo. Drilling at such depths requires all parties to set their standards still higher for difficult issues, such as remote containment systems in water depths with extreme pressures and very limited human access, as well as different geological pressures and formations and mixes of hydrocarbons. Desire to tap resources in deeper waters should be accompanied by equivalent investments in subsea equipment, operator training, research and development for containment and response technologies, demonstrated financial capacity, and continuous improvement in and communication of industry practices devoted to safety. The emerging international challenge. Drilling for oil in the Gulf of Mexico is not solely a matter of U.S. consideration. Both Mexico and Cuba have expressed interest in deepwater drilling in the Gulf in the near future. Pemex, Mexico's state-owned petroleum company, and Cuba, through both the Spanish company Repsol and the large Russian oil and gas production company Gazprom, in which the Russian government maintains a controlling stake, have either actually drilled exploratory and production wells or are likely soon to do so. Potential drilling sites are close enough to waters and land within U.S. jurisdiction. Cuba's mainland lies only 90 miles from Florida's coast, and the contemplated wells only 50 miles, that if an accident like the Deepwater Horizon spill occurs, fisheries, coastal tourism, and other valuable U.S. natural resources could be put at great risk. It is in our country's national interest to negotiate now with these near neighbors to agree on a common, rigorous set of standards, a system for regulatory oversight, and the same operator adherence to the effective safety culture called for in this report, along with protocols to cooperate on containment and response strategies and preparedness in case of a spill. Though some precedent exists for a direct agreement between the United States and Cuba, Mexico may prove an important partner in developing such an agreement covering the entire Gulf of Mexico. In any event, the U.S. objectives should be to prevent drilling by companies unwilling or unprepared to meet the high safety standards essential to extracting oil and gas resources responsibly, and to have a verification process to ensure compliance. Beyond the Gulf of Mexico, frontier regions. The nation's demand for domestic oil production will push the boundaries of technology and geography. The industry will develop new exploration and extraction techniques and equipment in new areas in the decades ahead. Drilling safely in the Gulf of Mexico requires a new industry safety culture and significantly improved regulatory oversight. Those reforms and further heightened vigilance will be required for oil exploration and production in frontier offshore regions. When the Macondo blowout dumped enormous volumes of oil into the Gulf waters, scientists and policymakers realized how little was known about biological systems, environmental conditions, and even key aquatic and coastal species. Leasing of vast acreage combined with weak policies and limited funding had resulted in inadequate studies of unique habitats and sensitive environmental features where greater caution should be exercised. What information was available was often not shared or was disregarded in leasing and permitting decisions. And little, if any, research or policy existed to address human health impacts and the risks to responders from a major spill, or the far-reaching effects of such a disaster on other businesses dependent on the region's resources. In addition to these challenges, each frontier area presents important differences in implementing any drilling program. Different geologies, hydrocarbon formations, coastal communities and environments, and climate conditions, to mention some. Federal waters of the United States other than the central and western Gulf of Mexico, parts of Southern California, and the Lower Cook Inlet in Alaska would be regarded as frontier territory. In the late 1970s, attention turned briefly to areas off Northern California and Massachusetts, Georges Banks. And in the early 1980s, the potential of the outer continental shelf off Alaska attracted considerable investment. See Chapter 2. In recent years, the focus has turned to exploring in the Atlantic Ocean off the state of Virginia, in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and most notably to taking another serious look at offshore regions in the Alaskan Arctic. Drilling water depths of 10,000 feet or more anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico might also be considered opening a new frontier, given the new technologies required. In March 2010, President Obama and Interior Secretary Ken Salazar announced a plan to open the eastern Gulf and parts of the Atlantic coast, including offshore Virginia, to oil and gas exploration, subject to studies of the suitability of doing so in each area and to the lifting of a congressional moratorium restricting drilling in the eastern Gulf. But on December 1st, in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon experience and the resulting broad restructuring of regulations and the federal oversight capabilities, Secretary Salazar announced that the administration would not proceed with drilling in areas where there are no active leases during the next 5-year leasing plan. As a result, exploration and production in certain frontier areas, the eastern Gulf and off the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, are deferred. The Secretary also indicated that plans for 2011 drilling in Alaska's Beaufort Sea would be subjected to additional environmental assessments. There will consequently be a continuing examination of the various stages of drilling, if pursued, consistent with national energy policy and with a full awareness of the risks and of the values that must be balanced in each region, and with assurance that operators rigorously adhere to the best practices of a functioning safety culture. By their very location and nature, these frontier areas differ from the Gulf of Mexico and in important respects from each other. Environmental and biological conditions are at least as well understood along the Atlantic coast as in the Gulf, and there are also important facilities, such as Coast Guard installations, in place. In contrast, equivalently detailed geological and environmental information does not exist for the Arctic exploration areas of greatest interest for energy exploration, and industry and support infrastructures are least developed or absent there. In the near term, the Alaskan frontier is likely to attract the greatest attention and to require the closest scrutiny given the potential energy resources and the physical and environmental challenges of pursuing them safely. Large prospects in offshore Alaska. The interest in offshore Alaska reflects the likelihood of finding significant new sources of oil. The Chukchi and Beaufort Sea areas off Alaska's north coast rank behind only the Gulf of Mexico in estimated domestic resources. The most recent federal lease sales for the Beaufort Sea from 2003 to 2008 netted $98 million, reflecting high levels of industry interest. And despite its remoteness and harsh conditions, the Chukchi Sea, with vast potential resources, attracted over $2.6 billion in high bids for almost 2.8 million acres, including $2.1 billion from Shell Oil Company during a 2008 lease sale. If deemed feasible, new offshore Alaskan oil production may be well-timed to offset the sustained decline in output elsewhere in Alaska. Oil production in the state, primarily from the onshore field at Prudhoe Bay, has decreased by more than 2/3 from the 1988 peak of 2 million barrels per day to 645,000 barrels per day in 2009. Depending on future prices, this decline could constitute a threat to the state's economy, which is highly dependent on oil and gas revenues and related employment. The Energy Information Administration projects that Alaska's production will continue to decline to just 420,000 barrels per day by the end of this decade. Such declines could threaten the viability of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline system, which transports oil from the North Slope to the port at Valdez. Despite the Energy Information Administration's pessimism about long-term production trends in Alaska, other projections show a potential upswing. An optimistic scenario developed in a 2009 study by Northern Economics for Shell Exploration and Development projects production from multiple Alaska outer continental shelf sites beginning in 2018 and eventually peaking at 1.8 million barrels of oil per day. New pipelines would need to be built to connect these reservoirs, if brought into production, to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. But finding and producing those potentially important supplies of oil offshore Arctic Alaska requires the utmost care, given the special challenges and risks associated with this frontier. Many of these challenges also arise elsewhere in the world, as Russia, Norway, Canada, and Denmark, Greenland, evaluate their Arctic oil and gas resources. The Alaskan Arctic is characterized by extreme cold, extended seasons of darkness, hurricane-strength storms, and pervasive fog, all affecting access and working conditions. The Chukchi and Beaufort Seas are covered by varying forms of ice for 8 to 9 months a year. These conditions limit exploratory drilling and many other activities to the summer months. The icy conditions during the rest of the year pose severe challenges for oil and gas operations and scientific research, and oil spill response efforts are complicated year-round by the remote location and the presence of ice at all phases of exploration and possible production. The geological pressures in hydrocarbon deposits in shallow seas off Alaska are likely to be substantially below those encountered at Macondo, reducing some of the risks of a major blowout and challenges of containment. But oil spilled off Alaska, from blowouts, pipeline or tanker leaks, or other accidents, is likely to degrade more slowly than that found in the Gulf of Mexico because of lower water temperatures, reduced mixing of the oil into the water due to the presence of ice, and the shallower depths throughout which oil would travel from the wellhead to the surface. Some think the slow weathering could facilitate the skimming and in situ burning of escaped oil under ideal weather conditions, but the slow pace of natural dispersion means that oil would linger much longer in the marine environment. And serious questions remain about how to access spilled oil when the area is iced over or in seasonal slushy conditions. The Arctic ecosystem, the need for scientific information and informed decision-making, and Alaska Native peoples. The stakes for drilling in the U.S. Arctic are raised by the richness of its ecosystems. The marine mammals in the Chukchi and Beaufort are among the most diverse in the world, including seals, cetaceans, whales, walruses, and bears. The Chukchi Sea is home to roughly 1/2 of America's and 1/10 of the world's polar bears. In November 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ruled that a large part of the polar bear's critical habitat included sea ice in the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. The Chukchi and Beaufort Seas also support millions of shorebirds, seabirds, and waterfowl, as well as abundant fish populations. It is known that these are vibrant living systems, but scientific research on the ecosystems of the Arctic is difficult and expensive. Good information exists for only a few species, and even for those, just for certain times of the year or in certain areas. As a result, the Commission recommends an immediate, comprehensive federal research effort to provide a foundation of scientific information on the Arctic, with periodic review by the National Academy of Sciences and annual stock assessments for marine mammals, fish, and birds that use the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. This initiative should be coordinated with the state of Alaska, Native organizations, academic institutions, non-governmental organizations, the private sector, and international partners. The information generated should be capable of informing decision-making related to oil and gas leasing, exploration and development, and production in the Arctic. Measuring and monitoring impacts of oil and gas development on Arctic ecological resources, natural resource damage assessment should an oil spill occur, and protocols in any treaty negotiated among the Arctic nations. The existing gaps in data also support an approach that distinguishes in leasing decisions between those areas where information exists and those where it does not, as well as where response capability may be less and the related environmental risks may therefore be greater. the need for additional research should not be used as a de facto moratorium on activity in the Arctic, but instead should be carried out with specific timeframes in mind in order to inform the decision-making process. The Inupiat Eskimos of Alaska's remote Arctic and subarctic communities rely heavily for their subsistence on resources from the marine environment, particularly bowhead whales. Bowhead whales can reach 60 feet in length and weigh more than 120,000 pounds. They migrate from Russian to Canadian waters and back through the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas. They are the most important subsistence animal for the coastal communities of northwest and northern Alaska. Whale hunting and the customs surrounding it are also an important part of their cultural heritage. Oil and gas development has the potential, directly or indirectly, to affect hunting success or the habitats of species important to subsistence. Of course, offshore development could play a positive economic role in the native communities. Some Inupiat whaling captains also work in the oil industry, for instance. An Arctic Regional Citizens Council could help assure the active participation of the people who know this region the best in planning and response. Arctic spill response and containment. The remoteness and weather of the Arctic frontier creates special challenges in the event of an oil spill. Successful oil spill response methods from the Gulf of Mexico or anywhere else cannot simply be transferred to the Arctic. Industry and academic organizations are conducting research on response to oil on ice, but more needs to be done. A comprehensive interagency research program to address oil spill containment and response issues in the Arctic should be developed, funded, and implemented within the federal government. Spill trajectory and weather models based on Arctic conditions must also be developed. This research should be funded promptly by the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, and the resulting analysis should inform when and where leasing occurs. The National Contingency Plan requires the Coast Guard to oversee oil spill planning and preparedness, and to supervise an oil spill response in coastal waters. Current federal emergency response capabilities in the region are very limited. The Coast Guard operations base nearest to the Chukchi region is on Kodiak Island, approximately 1,000 miles from the leasing sites. The Coast Guard does not have sufficient ice-class vessels capable of responding to a spill under Arctic conditions. 2 of its 3 polar icebreakers have exceeded their service lives and are non-operational. In addition to overseeing spill response, the Coast Guard provides search and rescue capabilities in other areas. Without a presence in the Arctic, it would be very difficult for the Coast Guard to conduct any emergency search and rescue operations. To deal with these serious concerns about Arctic oil spill response, containment, and search and rescue, the Commission recommends 3 approaches before the Department of the Interior makes a fully informed determination that drilling in a particular area is appropriate. First, the Department of the Interior should ensure that the containment and response plans proposed by industry are adequate for each stage of development, and that the underlying financial and technical capabilities have been satisfactorily demonstrated in the Arctic. Second, the Coast Guard and the oil companies operating in the Arctic should carefully delineate their respective responsibilities in the event of an accident, including search and rescue, and then must build and deploy the necessary capabilities. Third, Congress should provide the resources to establish Coast Guard capabilities in the Arctic, based on the Coast Guard's review of current and projected gaps in its capacity. International standards for Arctic oil and gas. The Arctic is shared by multiple countries, many of which are considering or conducting oil and gas exploration and development. The extreme weather conditions and infrastructure difficulties are not unique to the U.S. Arctic. The damages caused by an oil spill in one part of the Arctic may not be limited to the waters of the country where it occurred. As a result, the Commission recommends that strong international standards related to Arctic oil and gas activities be established among all the countries of the Arctic. Such standards would require cooperation and coordination of policies and resources. The Arctic Council has begun work in this direction, updating its voluntary Arctic offshore oil and gas operation guidelines in 2009. The International Standards Organization is also developing international standards for Arctic offshore structures that would apply to the activities of petroleum and natural gas industries in Arctic and cold regions. These guidelines are expected to specify requirements and provide recommendations and guidance for the design, construction, transportation, installation, and removal of offshore structures in the Arctic. Additional work is needed to strengthen these guidelines and standards, ensuring that they are both consistent and mandatory across the entire Arctic, and the United States could play an important leadership role in securing these vital safeguards. Bringing the potentially large oil resources of the Arctic outer continental shelf into production safely will require an especially delicate balancing of economic, human, environmental, and technological factors. Both industry and government will have to demonstrate standards and a level of performance higher than they have ever achieved before. One lesson from the Deepwater Horizon crisis is the compelling economic, environmental, and indeed human rationale for understanding and addressing the prospective risks comprehensively before proceeding to drill in such challenging waters. Conclusion. Creating and implementing a national energy policy will require enormous political effort and leadership, but it would do much to direct the nation toward a sounder economy and a safer and more sustainable environment in the decades to come. In the meantime, decisions about offshore drilling, one crucial element in any discussion of energy supply, remain controversial. The reaction to the December 1st decision to defer offshore exploration and production in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts illustrates the polarization of opinion. Energy companies seeking to pursue potential reserves in brand new frontiers criticized the announcement for closing off too many areas. Others, more concerned about environmental protection and national security, however, question why the Secretary was even considering allowing future drilling in these areas at all. And there were sharp differences in response among public officials in different regions, reflecting their local economies and sources of revenues. These reactions echo the divided opinions presented to this commission throughout its work. Though the commission heard many ideas for improving safety and other aspects of offshore drilling, we also heard from Americans who advocate no future drilling whatsoever. They cited the adverse effects of fossil fuels on the climate, environmental damage, safety, and other factors. Whether additional offshore drilling proceeds soon, in the longer term, or never depends on evolving public opinion. Given Americans' consumption of oil, finding and producing additional domestic supplies will be required in coming years, no matter what sensible and effective efforts are made to reduce demand, in response to economic, trade, and security considerations and the rising challenge of climate change. The extent to which offshore drilling contributes to augmenting that domestic supply depends importantly on rebuilding public faith in existing offshore energy exploration and production. That rebuilding begins with a clear, independent explanation of what happened at the Macondo well in April 2010, and of the reforms required in the wake of that terrible tragedy. That has been the work of this commission, published in this report, the forthcoming separate report of the Commission's Chief Counsel, and background materials available on the Commission's website. Together, they present a clear, independent, unvarnished picture of what happened and why, and of the major reforms the nation must adopt. This commission proposes in this report a series of recommendations that will enable the country and the oil and gas industry to move forward on this one critical element of U.S. energy policy: continuing safe, responsible offshore oil drilling to meet our nation's energy demands over the next decade and beyond. Our message is clear. Both government and industry must make dramatic changes to establish the high level of safety in drilling operations on the outer continental shelf that the American public has the right to expect and to demand. It is now incumbent upon the Congress, the executive branch, and the oil and gas industry to take the necessary steps. Respect for the 11 lives lost on that tragic day last April requires no less. End of Section 30. End of the final report from the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling.